Welcome to Echoes of History, a Ubisoft podcast and the place to explore the rich stories from the past that bring the world of Assassin's Creed to life. I'm Matt Lewis. The next 6 episodes continue our exciting adventure into the heart of an era that has shaped legends. In case you hadn't seen it, the world premiere trailer of Assassin's Creed Shadows was released recently, and we can see that it situates itself in feudal Japan. A time renowned for ninja and samurai. A time rich in history, culture, and stories. Over the next few weeks, we'll navigate the intricate landscape of power and ambition which you'll be able to explore as a player in Assassin's Creed Shadows. And we'll introduce you to the figures who dominated and dared to defy. From the warring states of the Sengoku period to the unification of Japan, we've explored a period in time that continues to fascinate. Next week, we'll take a closer look at the remarkable story of one of the 2 playable characters in Assassin's Creed Shadows, Yasuki, the first Black Samurai. But today, we continue our epic journey through the contours of time, focusing on Japan's first encounters with Portuguese missionaries. I'm joined by Fredrick Cryns, Professor of Japanese History at the International Research Centre for Japanese Studies in Kyoto, to discover how Europeans first reached Japanese shores and uncover the momentous impact these missionaries had on feudal Japanese society and culture. Welcome to Echoes of History, Fredrick. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. I can't wait to talk about this aspect of Japanese medieval life, and it's sort of their first real contact with Europeans. Can you tell us a little bit about when Portuguese missionaries first arrive in Japan? When does that contact begin?
Well, that begins in the middle of the 16th century, in 1549 to be correct. The Portuguese, they traveled to the east from the 15th century on. And in 1498, I think they established a sea route to India. And they went even further. And in the beginning of the 16th century, they already were in Malacca. But then it still took some time for them to reach Japan. It was in 1542 or 43, it's still being disputed, that the first Portuguese merchants reached Japan. And at the same time, you had the Society of Jesus, which started in 1540. And soon after the papal bull was ordained, Francis Xavier, who was a Jesuit and one of the founding members of the Jesuits, he was asked to travel to Asia to begin doing missionary work there. He was asked especially by King John III of Portugal, because he was very keen on trying to get as many Asians adhering to the Christian religion. So Xavier had quite a correspondence with King John about all what he did in Asia, and it wasn't what he expected. In 1542, he came to India, but he didn't get good results, so he tried to go to Malacca. But there was not much interest for his propagating of the faith. And there he met with a Japanese called Anjiro. Probably his real name was Yajiro. And he told him about Japan. And also some Portuguese merchants who had gone to Japan told him that that will be the country where you really are going to get a lot of people converted to Christianity. So he had a lot of expectations for Japan. And in 1549, he finally set foot on Japan. So that was really the first time that the Jesuits arrived in Japan, only 6 or 7 years after the first Portuguese came there. So very soon.
So the initial contact is really about merchants looking for places to trade, but it very quickly turns into a religious mission. And there seems to be an element there that Japan was identified as somewhere that might be sort of ripe for Christianization, that there might be a will there to be converted to Christianity, which would have been a draw, presumably, for the Jesuits.
Yes, so the Jesuits thought, and it was true, of course, that the Japanese were very intellectual people. Because Xavier first met with Anjiro, And this guy could speak Portuguese and he learned a lot of languages. He went to the seminario in Goa, so he became very proficient in the Christian faith. So he had very high expectations of Japan. And when he came in Japan, he first thought that the Japanese religion, which was Buddhism, was a kind of Christianity, because the Jesuits and the Europeans thought that in earlier times, Prester John and all those people went to Asia and established Christianity there. So they thought that in Japan they would find a sort of ancient form of Christianity. And he met people from the Shingon sect, which esoteric Buddhist sect, which adhered to Dainichi Nyorai, which is a cosmic sort of Buddha. So Xavier himself, he preached Christianity and talked about the Christian God as Dainichi. Of course, after a time, he found out that this was not Christianity at all, that this was a total different religion. So he changed into Deus. But still, he found, and the other Jesuits who came after him, found a lot of similarities with Buddhism in Japan. So they thought that if the Japanese knew about the true faith, that those Japanese would readily convert to Christians.
Interesting. So their understanding of Buddhism made it feel like it would be an easy move to Christianity that might be quite an easy sell after failing in India?
Yes, that was certainly one of the things they thought. And also they had seen that when Xavier came in Japan, he landed in Satsuma, Kagoshima, which is in the southern part of the Kyushu island. And you had a warlord there, Shimazu Takahisa, and he welcomed Xavier very much because he had a motive. If the Jesuits would come, he thought the Portuguese merchants would follow. So he treated Xavier very well and he gave him permission to preach the gospel in his domains. But after a year, no Portuguese ship arrived. So then he prohibited Christianity, and Xavier was compelled to go to another domain, which was the Hirado domain of Matsura Takanobu. And just at that time, there was a Portuguese vessel there. And when the Portuguese saw the Jesuits, so Xavier and his companions, they greeted them with the utmost respect. And Takanobu saw that, so he thought, okay, I have to treat them also with respect so that the Portuguese traders could come. Because those Portuguese traders, they got a lot of products. One was weapons, especially arquebuses, so rifles that the Japanese could use. And they also had silk of China, because Japan wasn't allowed to trade with China directly. But the Portuguese could purchase goods from China and send those goods to Japan. And those silk goods were very in demand in Japan among the samurai class, so brought a very high profit.
It's interesting that the Japanese response was, I guess, fairly cynical. They're willing to welcome the religious people because they want the trade that they hope will follow, willing to kick them out when that doesn't materialize. But then for Xavier as well, when he moves on and this merchant ship anchors at the same time that he's arriving, that must have felt to him like a sign from God that he's in the right place and doing the right thing.
Probably, yes. And he thought that if he goes to the emperor in Kyoto, in the capital, that the emperor would give him permission to preach in whole of Japan, and that he would have a lot of success, because he saw that the lord of a small domain, when he gave permission, he got a chance to convert a few people. If the upper lord of the country would give him permission, he thought he would be in a good position to convert a lot of Japanese. So he went to Kyoto, but that materialized not very well, because Kyoto at the time was in the midst of warfare. So he didn't have the chance to meet with the emperor nor with the shogun. And he had made a mistake. Well, a mistake not from his standpoint. He tried to look as frugal and simple as possible, to convey to the people that he was a pure religious at heart. But the Japanese at the time, they didn't like poor people. So he was not treated very well on the way to Kyoto. And he had the same experience when he was in Yamaguchi, which was then a very thriving city on the way to Kyoto, where he went to the Lord Ouchi Yoshitaka, And this lord didn't like him because of his poor appearance. So afterwards, he went back from Kyoto. He got back to Hirado, where he put on very expensive clothes, and then went again to the court of Ouchi, and then he was received very well. He also gave a lot of presents which he had brought from Portugal, and Ouchi was very pleased with that and gave permission for the Jesuits to preach their gospel in his domains. So there, Xavier saw how he had to arrange the missionary work in Japan. It was different from Europe. They had to appear like the Buddhist monks, which were also very expensive clothes. And in this way, they had to impress the Japanese.
It's really interesting in those early contacts how they both seem to have their own motives and they're both willing to adapt their approaches to fit with each other. So the Japanese are willing to welcome Christians because they think it'll bring trade, and the Jesuits are willing to portray themselves as something they wouldn't normally, as wealthy men, well-dressed men, in an effort to make sure they get in with the Japanese. So there is this kind of trying to click and work together from both sides.
Yes, I think that both were adapting to the other. Perhaps the Jesuits more than the Japanese, because as you say, when they saw that there was nothing to be gained from a relationship with the Jesuits, they just cut them out. And you also had problems, for example, in Hirado, when some Japanese became Christians, they became quite aggressive against the Buddhists. So you got internal strife in the Hirado domain, and that was the reason why Takanobu prohibited Christianity from then on. So you have really different motives from both sides, and probably a stronger position from the Japanese than the Jesuits. So they were really encouraged to change some of their Western methods to better please the Japanese.
And given that Japanese cynicism, I guess, about wanting the Christians there because it will bring trade, what do we know about what the Japanese thought of those early arrivals from Europe? What did they make of European people?
Well, I think that at the time you have some words like Nambanjin, which means southern barbarians. So they saw perhaps the Portuguese more as barbarians than as equals. But still, as a whole, I think they really loved new things in Japan like they do now. New knowledge, new rare objects, and so on. They really like those stuffs because they have a long tradition from importing a lot of things from China, Korea, and so on. So this was a new culture presented to them with new artifacts, all kinds of Christian artifacts like paintings and crosses and statues and so on. And I think they got a liking for the exotism that those Western objects brought to them. And the century is called the Christian century in Japan because they adapted so much in their culture at the time. So I think they were positively disposed towards those Jesuits and Portuguese or Western culture as a whole.
It's interesting in calling them Southern barbarians. It does suggest that the Japanese felt that they were exploiting the Europeans, that they were just getting from the Europeans rather than working with them, that it was an unequal partnership from the Japanese point of view.
Yes, I think they saw it really as some exotism, but you have the strange effect that when they became Christians, and that is something that the Jesuits wrote in their reports about Japan, it was quite different from, for example, in India. If you converted an Indian to Christianity, it had to be done with a lot of force, and when they became Christians, they were not that faithful. While the Japanese, when they became Christians, they attended church and the sermons, and some of them really became very fervent Christians. So in a sense, when they get used to this new culture, to those new people, some became very close. You have, for example, Otomo Yoshishige, who became a Christian after a long time, but he was very well disposed against the Jesuits. You have other people like Takayama Ukon, who became a very fervent Christian, and all his samurai also. So they were very fond of them and they listened to the Jesuits. They asked them a lot about politics, how they could manage this or that issue. So the Jesuits got a lot of influence with some warlords and also with a lot of the peasants and the lower ranked people. So they really had some success that they didn't experience in other countries.
It's an interesting view on Japan, I think. We often view it as quite a closed society, but they were clearly willing to welcome a lot of these things in. Who else during this period were important missionaries? We've talked a lot about Xavier as the first to arrive there. Were there other important Portuguese missionaries that followed him?
Well, you have a lot of colorful figures among the Jesuits. Xavier left in 1551, but soon there came more and more Jesuits. I think Caspar Villela is one who stands out. He was a very keen propagator of the Christian faith, and he could convert some warlords to Christianity. One of them was Omura Sumitada, who eventually would give a port to the Jesuits, which was called Nagasaki. You have Almeida. Almeida was a merchant and a surgeon, and he came to Japan in connection with the silk trade between China and Japan. And he was very wealthy. But in 1555, after 3 years in Japan, he decided to become a Jesuit himself. And so he gave all his wealth to the church. And he was also instrumental in establishing a hospital and an orphanage in Funai, which was the capital of Bungo, which was the domain of Otomo Yoshishige, a very powerful warlord in Kyushu. So a lot of Jesuits who really cared about their faith and who really did a very good job in charity, in converting a lot of Japanese to Christianity. And then you have, of course, Vanigliano, which was the visitor, as he was called, to the Orient. So he was the head of all the actions in the Orient. And he spent a lot of time in Japan because Japan was the place where the Jesuits thought they would have the best results. Frois is another one, Louis Frois. He was the historian of the Jesuits. He wrote all the lengthy reports about Japan. Every year, the Jesuits wrote a report about what they had done in Japan, about the political situation of Japan and all the Christian communities in all the places, especially in Kyushu. And that was a very lengthy report. It was mostly over 100 pages every year. And those reports are very valuable because Frois wrote too much for the liking of his superiors. They always said it's too much, you have to make it more compact. But because of all those reports, we have vivid impressions of what Japan was like at the time, and also all kinds of political developments within Japan.
It's interesting that his superiors were probably thinking this is a meeting that could have been an email, but we have to be grateful, I guess, that he does give us all of this colour and all of this additional information that we otherwise wouldn't have.
Indeed. And that information was used by the Jesuits in Europe for propaganda. So they published, after some censorship, Louis Frois and Villeras and other letters in Italy. And they were also translated in several languages like Latin, German, French, and so on, for the Catholic Reformation in Europe. They would say, see what we can do in Asia and especially in Japan. We probably have lost England, but we have gained another island in the form of Japan. So they did a lot of propaganda, which gave them additional financial resources, and many European Jesuits who wanted to join the efforts in Japan, which was good for them for a time, but could work as a double-edged sword.
This is After Dark, Myths, Misdeeds and the Paranormal.
The podcast that takes you to the shadiest corners of the past, unpicking history's spookiest, strangest and most sinister stories. I'm Maddie Pelling.
And I'm Anthony Delaney. Join us every Monday and Thursday and we'll take a look at the darker side of history, from haunted pubs to Houdini to witch trials and arsenic-laced breakfasts.
Follow After Dark, Myths, Misdeeds and the Paranormal wherever you get your podcasts. Brought to you by History Hit.
And you mentioned that the Japanese partly welcomed the Portuguese because they bought new things. They bought access to silk that they couldn't get from China because trade there was barred. Did the Portuguese and that contact with Europeans bring anything to Japan that really changed Japanese society?
First of all, I think faith. So the Christian religion, they converted probably the most, in the best time, it was probably 200,000 or 300,000 Japanese, which is a phenomenal figure. So those Christian Japanese became quite a force to be reckoned with. They also brought in firearms, which were copied right away, which became a crucial factor in samurai warfare. So probably those two were the most important things that the Portuguese brought to Japan that changed history. And you see Otomo Yoshishige, you see the Miyoshis in Kyoto, you see Oda Nobunaga incorporating those firearms in their armies. And I think before that, you really had more one-on-one combat with the samurai, but with the introduction of those firearms, it became more of standing armies shooting at each other from a distance. So the way of warfare of the samurai really changed a lot through that introduction.
And I guess reflects the way warfare was changing in Europe at the time as well, where there was much more of a move towards the gun and away from the sword. But it's interesting that contact with the Portuguese maybe brings that to Japan at roughly the same sort of time too.
Yes, I think so too.
How did the missionaries sort of operate in Japan? Were they holding sort of big scale baptisms? Were they establishing churches, or was it much more quiet than that?
They would first establish a church, and you have to think of a church as a Buddhist temple because they didn't import Western architecture, so they had to do what was available for them. And at first they would use abundant Buddhist temples. And afterwards, they would build their own temples, but those temples would be in the same style as the Buddhist temples, with the only difference that they put a cross on top of the roofs. Also, the interior was quite the same, but they put a lot of Western furniture in the interior. But that was really the only difference with the Buddhist churches. So they first started to teach the Japanese the Christian religion. And they did that mostly through the help of the Japanese. So they had a lot of Japanese lay brothers, which they called iruman. They also had dojuku, which you could translate as people who lodged with them or who were guests with them. And those people were aspirant priests. So Japanese who wanted to become Jesuit priests, which was something that the Jesuits didn't like very much. They really hesitated to ordain Japanese as priests. I think around 1600, there were 2 Japanese who were ordained priests. So that's already 50 years after the Jesuits first came. So that's a long time.
Why were they so reticent to do that? Because it would seem like the more Japanese priests you could get, the easier it might be to spread the religion. Why were they so cautious about that?
Because the Jesuits needed a long period of education. In Europe, when you wanted to become a Jesuit, you had years and years and years that you had to train in all facets of Christianity. You had to learn Latin and so on. And for the Japanese, it wasn't possible to learn Latin when they were in Japan. So that was a stumbling block. And that made the Japanese very willing to serve the Jesuits and to propagate the Christian faith, but as lay brothers, aspirant priests. And that was something that irritated the Japanese. This information we can find in the letters, for example, of Valdiviano. But still, the Jesuits weren't very eager to make them priests. But I would say that most of the work was done by those Japanese lay brothers, because you had the problem of the language, and the Jesuits themselves, they would also preach by themselves. Some would learn the Japanese language very well, but mostly they would be in charge of teaching the Japanese lay brothers how they have to do it.
It's an interesting sort of juxtaposition between the Jesuit desire to get there and convert as many people as possible, but also that kind of cultural and spiritual break on the fact that, hang on, not everyone can be a Jesuit priest. So they're almost holding themselves back a little bit.
Yes, but really that was a problem that he had in Europe too. So it wasn't easy to become a Jesuit in Europe itself. So then for the Japanese to make them Jesuits very easily would have had some backlash in Europe, I think. So everything what Valignano and his fellows decided had to be sent to Europe to be approved. So there they had a problem. And they also had a problem that after a while you have Cabral, you have Coelho, so two Jesuits who became the head of the Japan sector. And they weren't very keen to adopt Japanese customs. They wanted to be as strictly Jesuit as in Europe. So they already have a problem from the Jesuit side. And many like Villela or Frois were more inclined to adopt Japanese customs, but the heads of the provincials, as they call them, were against that. So a lot of problems within the Jesuit mission of which way to go in Japan.
And do we see many of the leading members of Japanese society, the daimyo, for example, do we see them converting to Christianity? And if we do we think that's genuine conversion, or is it for political or economic purposes to attach themselves to the trade?
Well, I think you have 3 or 4 warlords in Kyushu who converted to Christianity, and some of them were very fervent Christians, like Omura Sumitada, for example. Otomo Sorin or Yoshishige also in his later years became a very fervent Christian. So you had other lords who became Christian who weren't that fervent, who just wanted the trade, but still Takayama Ukon was really an ardent, tough Christian, to say so. So some really got into it, but many didn't convert. So you had, for example, Oda Nobunaga, which showed great familiarity to the Christians, to, for example, Frois, who he invited in Kyoto, in Gifu, in his castle, and showed him around in the castle. So he was very positively inclined towards the Christians, but still he never adopted the Christian faith himself. You also have his successor, Hideyoshi, which also was positively inclined in the earlier years towards Christianity, but he too, he didn't become a Christian. So you had the two opposites, to say so.
And we talked a little bit about the challenges that the Jesuits faced from within their own movement about how they should interact with the Japanese culture and communities. Did they face any challenges from Japan? Was there lots of resistance to the appearance of Christians?
In the beginning, not so much, but when they got more and more converts, they had a lot of opposition from the Buddhist monks. And the problem really was that when they converted Christians, they began to attack the Buddhist monks and the Buddhist temples. And a lot of Buddhist temples were destroyed, especially in Omura, which was the domain of Omura Sumitada, who was a fervent Christian. So he just let the Christians do what they wanted. And some Japanese began to dislike the Christians. So he got more and more opposition when there became more and more Christians.
Yeah, so I guess there's an element there of the Christians being victims of their own success, because as soon as you succeed, you swell numbers, you become a political threat and a religious threat to other people, and therefore you become a target. So they almost fall into a trap of their own success.
Yes, indeed.
And in terms of their relationship with the government of Japan, how do Christians get on? Because they seem to have that early success, but then there seems to quite quickly be some persecution, which will eventually lead to a ban on Christianity.
Well, Oda Nobunaga, which is seen as the first unifier of Japan, was very positively inclined towards the Jesuits. And then you have Hideyoshi. And Hideyoshi was continuing the unification of Japan. And there was one area which he had to continue was Kyushu. So Kyushu wasn't conquered yet. And you had Otomo, which was a very powerful clan in the east of Kyushu. And then you had in the southwest, you had the Shimazu. And Otomo was losing against the Shimazu. So he asked Hideyoshi to intervene. And sometime before Hideyoshi marched towards Kyushu, he met with Coelho, which was then the head of the Christian mission in Japan, together with Frois. And he treated Coelho very well, just like Oda Nobunaga had done with Frois. So Coelho was really pleased with that. And then Hideyoshi asked him, I want to invade Korea. Can you provide 2 Portuguese ships to help me in this invasion? And if I conquer Korea, I will make it that there are a lot of churches being built there. So Coelho said, yes, I will do that for you. And I will make sure that we have 2 Portuguese ships, the Karak ships as they were called by the English, gigantic ships. So Hideyoshi could very well use them for his invasion of Korea. And then he went a step further and he said, I will make sure that the Christian warlords in Kyushu will also support you. And I think at that moment that Hideyoshi, that there was a ring belling in his head, that the Christians, the Jesuits, had too much influence in Japan. If they could influence some warlords, then they posed a danger to his reign. But he didn't mention that. And he marched into Kyushu, and when he had conquered Kyushu, he again met with Coelho on a Portuguese ship. And Coelho again said that we will support you in whatever endeavor you will take. But the night, suddenly he sent a questionnaire to Coelho, asking him why they came to Japan, why they are making so much converts, and why are they destroying the Buddhist temples. Of course, Coelho was really shocked with that. He was so well treated and suddenly everything changed overnight. So he gave his answer that, well, they came to Japan just to propagate their faith in good faith, and that it was not them who destroyed the Buddhist temples, but the Japanese converts. To that answer, the answer of Hideyoshi was that he made a decree that the Jesuits had to leave Japan in 20 days. So suddenly, after so much success, the Jesuits now had to leave Japan immediately.
And it sounds like the real reason behind that was that entanglement of religious success looking like political power. So if they can provide ships to help him invade Korea and they can direct the actions of some of the Japanese warlords, suddenly they're not religious missionaries, they're a political power which are a threat to Hideyoshi.
Indeed. And at the same night, Takayama Ukon, who was a fervent Christian warlord, was deprived of all his domains and eventually banished. So that makes clear that Hideyoshi was afraid of political power of the Jesuits. But he didn't enforce the order very strictly. And that was the same reason why the other warlords welcomed the Jesuits, because he didn't want to disrupt the trade with the Portuguese. So he promulgated that decree, but afterwards the Jesuits stayed in Japan and still continued their missionary work there. So at that time, the Jesuits didn't have that much problems, but still it was an early warning for what was to come.
Yeah, sort of an official warning shot across their bows to make them wary of what they were up to. I guess you mentioned that this is still called in Japan the Christian century. What is the legacy of this early contact with Christianity and with the Jesuits in Japan? Is that still felt today?
Well, in the beginning, they had a lot of influence in the arts. So you have Namban Bijutsu, so Namban art or Southern barbarian art. Southern because they came from the south, of course, to Japan. A lot of influence also in technologies, in surgery, in cosmology. But afterwards, the successor of Hideyoshi, which was Tokugawa Ieyasu, he forbade Christianity totally. And all influence of the Jesuits was erased very systematically from then on. So in the Edo period, the long period of Tokugawa peace, there were not much remnants of the Christian faith in Japan. You had the hidden Christians, the Kakure Christians, who continued in secret their devotion to Maria and Christ. But apart from that, you really have, in the Edo period, many Japanese who don't know anything about the Christian faith anymore. So that's how roughly the faith was erased. I've been to Hirado domain to search the official documents of the Hirado domain, and I haven't found anything related to Christianity. So all of those documents were destroyed. And the same in the other domains, I think.
Yeah. So it's kind of a little blip that goes away as quickly as it arrived almost.
Yes.
Well, it's been absolutely fascinating to talk about this early contact between Europeans and Japanese people and the influence that they were both having over each other. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
And I would say as well, if anyone wants to know a little bit more about this kind of period, Fredrick has a new book coming out called In the Service of the Shogun, which examines early contacts between Europeans and Christians, particularly in this case, the first Englishmen to reach Japan. And I've been really, really enjoying the book. So thank you very much, Fredrick.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Echoes of History, a Ubisoft podcast. In the next episode, we'll be taking a closer look at one of the two playable characters in Assassin's Creed Shadows, Yazuki, the first Black Samurai. Join us next week to find out more.